Have you ever woken from a dream so sharp, so strangely precise, that for a moment you weren't sure which world was real? A dream that seemed to leave an imprint, something that lingered long after the morning light returned. Near the end of the Victorian era, when rational thought battled daily with the whispers of folklore, one curious scholar set out to explore these uncanny intersections. That scholar was Andrew Lang, and within his 1897 collection, The Book of Dreams and Ghosts, he preserved accounts from ordinary people who insisted that their dreams had slipped into the realm of the living. Warnings, visions, coincidences far too eerie to ignore. Lang never claimed these stories proved anything supernatural. Instead, he suggested that perhaps the veil between dreaming and waking is far more delicate than we imagine. The Assyrian Priest. Our first tale comes from the world of ancient Babylon, and from the dream of a man who spent his life trying to decipher it. Professor H.V. Hilprecht, a scholar of Assyriology at the University of Pennsylvania, had been poring over two puzzling fragments of agate, tiny pieces marked with mysterious cuneiform characters. The fragments had been uncovered during an archaeological expedition, and sketches of them had been sent back to Philadelphia. Everyone believed they were pieces of broken finger rings, but they didn't quite make sense. Hilprecht spent an exhausting Saturday night in March of 1893 trying to decipher them. The markings suggested a date somewhere between 1700 and 1140 BC, and one symbol seemed as though it might refer to King Kurigalzu, but nothing fit neatly together. Weary and frustrated, he finally abandoned his work and went to bed. That is when the dream came. Hilprecht found himself standing beside a tall, thin priest, an ancient servant of the pre-Christian temple of Nippur, dressed in a simple Abba robe. Wordlessly, the priest led him through the ruins until they reached a small chamber in the southeast corner of the temple treasury. The room was low-ceilinged, windowless, and littered with scraps of agate and lapis lazuli. In the center stood a wooden chest. There, the priest turned to him and spoke, quite fluently and rather surprisingly, in an American accent. He told the professor that the two fragments he had been studying did not come from finger rings at all, and that they were not separate pieces, but parts of a single object. They had once belonged to a votive cylinder of agate, an offering sent by King Kurigalzu to the Temple of Bel around 1300 BC. But when the priest was suddenly ordered to fashion a pair of agate earrings for the statue of the god Nibib, disaster struck. There was no raw agate left. So, in desperation, they cut the king's votive cylinder into 3 pieces. 2 pieces were transformed into earrings for the god. Those earrings, the priest explained, were the very fragments that Professor Hilprecht had been puzzling over. If you place them together, the dream priest said, you will see that my words are true. But the third piece, you have not found it, and you never will. With that, the dream ended. Hilprecht awoke with a shock. His wife later recalled hearing him rush into his study, crying out, "It is so! It is so!" The next day, with clearer light and steadier hands, he compared the drawings once more and realized the dream had been correct. But drawings alone were not enough. He traveled to the Imperial Museum in Constantinople, where the actual fragments were kept, stored in 2 separate cases, never before connected. When he placed them side by side, they matched perfectly. The stone's white vein continued seamlessly across both pieces. The inscription, once the final puzzle, now made sense. To the god Nibib, child of the god, Bel, his lord, Kurigalzu, pontifex of the god Bel, has presented it. A dream had provided the missing context, tying together evidence that waking logic had struggled to assemble. Scholars later argued that Hilprecht had unconsciously reasoned through the problem, that his mind, during sleep, simply arranged the clues dramatically, presenting the solution through the figure of an ancient priest. Perhaps that is true, but the result was undeniable. What he could not solve by day, the dream revealed by night. And it raises a question that will linger over all the stories in this collection. How much of our dreaming mind is imagination, and how much is insight from somewhere beyond our waking reach? The knot in the shutter. Our next tale concerns a man who built his reputation on skepticism, and the single dream that fractured it. William Hone, a well-known satirist and outspoken materialist of the early 19th century, prided himself on mocking anything that hinted at the supernatural. Ghosts, visions, premonitions, he dismissed them all as nonsense. Until, one night, Hone dreamt he was led into a room he had never seen before, utterly unfamiliar, yet strangely vivid. In the dream, he saw himself seated at a table, and when he moved toward the window, something caught his eye. A knot in the wooden shutter, twisted, oddly shaped, unmistakable. When he awoke, the entire scene lingered with remarkable clarity. But Hone brushed it aside. It was only a dream, after all. Also, he thought. Sometime later, weeks or months, the accounts differ, Hone found himself travelling on business to a part of London he had never visited. As he was shown into a room where he was to wait, a strange shock went through him. He knew this room. Every detail aligned with the dream. The layout, the window, the quiet stillness of the space. And then, with a mixture of dread and curiosity, another thought struck him. If this is the room from my dream, then there must be a knot in the shutter. He crossed the floor, opened the window shutter, and there it was. The same knot, the same shape, exactly where he had seen it in his sleep. For a man who had spent his life ridiculing anything that hinted at the spiritual, this moment was devastating. His rational explanations crumbled. Here was a detail he could not have guessed, could not have imagined, and certainly could not have known beforehand, yet had seen exactly in a dream. This single incident did not convert him on the spot, but it shook him. It planted the seed that grew into doubt and eventually into belief. His friends later said that this moment was one of the first cracks in the wall of materialism he had built around himself. Hone would go on to become a deeply spiritual man, but it began here, not with a miracle, not with a revelation, but with a simple knot in a shutter that should never have existed outside a dream. Stories like this lead us deeper into the uncanny territory of dreams that reveal what is hidden, past, present, or future, and leave us wondering just how much our minds truly see when our eyes are closed. The Deathbed. Our third tale is a quiet one, yet perhaps the most heartbreaking. Before her marriage, a young woman known to us as Mademoiselle C lived in Paris with her uncle, a respected physician and member of the French Institute. Her mother, meanwhile, lay gravely ill in the countryside. One night, as the girl slept far from home, a strange and sorrowful vision came to her. In the dream, she found herself standing beside her mother's bed. The woman looked pale, exhausted, clearly nearing death. Around her stood several attendants, whispering anxiously. But what struck Mademoiselle C most deeply was her mother's distress. She seemed troubled by the absence of two of her children. One, a priest living all the way in Spain. The other, her daughter in Paris. Then, in the dream, someone called out a name, Charlotte. The attendants entered carrying a small child, Charlotte, the dreamer's niece and goddaughter. The dying woman looked at the child, then shook her head gently. With a faint gesture, she indicated that this was not the Charlotte she longed for. She wanted her daughter, the one who was not at her side. The dreamer watched her mother's expression shift, grief, longing, resignation. Then the woman fell back against her pillow and died. When Mademoiselle C awoke, the weight of the dream hung upon her so heavily that her uncle immediately noticed her sadness. Pressed to explain, she reluctantly told him what she had seen. Her uncle embraced her tenderly. Then, with great difficulty, he confessed the truth. Her mother had died, just as she dreamed, during the night. Months later, while organizing her uncle's papers during his absence, she discovered a letter he had kept hidden from her. It described her mother's final moments in detail, the longing for her absent children, the mistaken arrival of the little niece, the gesture rejecting the child, seeking instead the daughter far away. And lastly, her mother's death exactly as Charlotte had witnessed it in sleep. Every detail matched the dream. Her uncle had concealed the letter, fearing the knowledge would wound her too deeply. But the truth had reached her, regardless by a path no one could explain. Scholars like Boismont would later shrug and speak of unknown relations in the moral and physical world. Every Victorian scientist's way of admitting confusion without surrendering to mysticism. Others would cite mental telegraphy or coincidence. But for the young woman who dreamed her mother's final breath, no explanation was necessary. Some dreams, she believed, are not dreams at all, but farewells. The dream of Mr. Perceval's murder. Our next story is one of the most famous dream premonitions in British history. A dream so vivid, so precise, and so tragically accurate that it haunted everyone who heard it. It was the spring of 1812, and John Williams of Scoria House, a practical man, more concerned with the management of Cornish mines than with politics, was living a quiet, industrious life. He had little interest in the affairs of London, and even less awareness of who governed the country. Matters of state simply did not cross his mind. And yet, one night, around the 2nd or 3rd of May, he had a dream that would shake him to his core. In the dream, Williams found himself standing in the lobby of the House of Commons, a place he knew well. The hall was busy with movement and the low murmur of conversation. As he watched, a small man wearing a blue coat and white waistcoat entered the lobby. At that exact moment, another man, whom Williams had noticed earlier, dressed in a snuff-coloured coat with bright metal buttons, stepped forward. Without hesitation, he drew a pistol from beneath his coat and aimed it directly at the newcomer. Williams tried to cry out, but the shot rang out before he could move. He saw the ball strike the small man beneath the left breast, saw the blood spread across the white waistcoat, saw the victim's face change, shock, agony, collapse. When Williams asked, in the dream, who the wounded man was, he was told it was the Chancellor, Mr. Spencer Perceval, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He watched as the assassin was seized by several gentlemen nearby, struggling as they forced him to the ground. He woke in terror and told the entire dream to his wife, who tried to soothe him, insisting it was nothing but a nightmare. But when Williams drifted back to sleep, the dream returned. The same scene, the same shot, the same horror, again and again. 3 times the dream repeated itself exactly. By morning, he was so shaken that he wondered whether he ought to travel to London and warn someone. But when he confided in friends at one of the Cornish mines the next day, they discouraged him. Better to stay silent than risk ridicule, or worse, suspicion. So Williams said no more. But every evening, as the post arrived, he anxiously opened the newspapers. Then came the night of May 13th. No news appeared in print, but his second son burst into the room, breathless, exclaiming, "Father, your dream has come true. Mr. Perceval has been shot in the lobby of the House of Commons." The assassination had occurred on May 11th, just as Williams had seen. Later, when business called him to London, Williams visited a print shop and found an illustration depicting the murder. When he examined it closely, he felt a chill. Every detail matched his dream. The blue coat and white waistcoat of the victim, the metal buttons on the assassin's coat, the exact spot on the chest where the bullet struck, even the attitudes, the faces, the moment the Chancellor fell. It was all as he had already witnessed days before it happened. The dream became famous among William's circle of acquaintances, and eventually he was asked to recount it to commissioners of the Navy. They too were struck by the precision of his memory. Years later, when he wrote down the account, he ended it with a solemn declaration. It was all true, exactly as he remembered. Stories of dreams that foretell the future are rare, and reliable ones rarer still. Yet this extraordinary case, documented and attested during William's lifetime, remains one of the most compelling instances of a dream, seemingly peering beyond the veil of time. The Coral Sprigs. Our next story takes place in the winter of 1881 in New York City, where a mother's dream seemed to run ahead of reality. Mrs. Weiss of St. Louis had traveled east to care for her daughter, Ada, who was expecting a child. On the night of January 21st, she had a dream so vivid, so strangely detailed, that it remained with her even after dawn. In the dream, Ada suddenly went into labor. Something had gone wrong with the arrangements, and no one had been able to reach Ada's husband, Mr. C, who was supposed to fetch the doctor. The nurse arrived, but still no doctor, and no sign of Mr. C. As the hours dragged on, fear began to rise. Then Mrs. Weiss heard footsteps pounding up the stairs. She rushed to the landing and cried, "Oh, Chan, for heaven's sake, get a doctor. Ada may be confined at any moment." In the dream, Mr. C ran off in a panic, leaving her alone with her suffering daughter. And then something inexplicable happened. Mrs. Weiss suddenly felt she knew exactly what to do. Though she had no experience in delivering children, a calm certainty came over her. She acted instinctively, assuredly. Soon after, Mr. C returned with a doctor, a young man, tall, brown-eyed, dark-haired, with a ruddy complexion. He wore grey trousers, a grey vest, and a bright blue cravat, decorated with tiny coral sprigs. The cravat, strangely vivid, was the detail that fixed itself most sharply in her mind. The dream doctor examined Ada, declared everything in order, and left. At breakfast the next morning, Mrs. Weiss recounted the dream to her daughter and son-in-law. They laughed it off. Dreams were dreams, nothing more. But the next day brought a heavy snowstorm that snapped telegraph wires across the city. Communication became difficult, and Mrs. Weiss began to feel uneasy. By Tuesday, Ada's labor pains made a doctor urgently necessary. Mrs. Weiss sent a telegram for Mr. C. He eventually arrived, hurried back out to find a doctor, and vanished for what felt like far too long. Inside the house, a moment of strange clarity struck Mrs. Weiss. The same certainty she had felt in her dream swept over her again, calm, confident, almost detached. She heard herself say, "Ada, don't be afraid. I know just what to do. All will go well." And astonishingly, it did. When Mr. C finally returned, after trying the homes of 7 different doctors, he brought with him a young stranger. Mrs. C whispered, almost in disbelief, "Look at the doctor's cravat." It was bright blue, patterned with coral sprigs. Only then did Mrs. Weiss fully remember that her dream had already shown her this exact moment. Her account was later confirmed by multiple witnesses. Mr. Blanchard, who heard the story days after it happened. Ada herself, who remembered every essential detail, and the attending nurse, who recalled Mrs. C whispering that she recognized the doctor from her mother's dream. The only person who remembered nothing was Mr. C, a man who, according to his wife, never recalled anything outside his business affairs. Still, the others remembered. And the coral-sprigged cravat, bright, unlikely, unmistakable, remains one of the strangest pieces of dream foreshadowing ever recorded. The Satin Slippers. Our next tale comes from the American Midwest, a story of death, a dream, and a secret sewn into a shirt. In February of 1891, a farmer named Michael Conley left his home near Ionia, Iowa, to travel to Dubuque for medical treatment. He left behind his 2 grown children, Pat and his daughter Elizabeth, a healthy young woman of 28. Just 2 days later, on February 3rd, Michael was found dead in an outhouse near the inn where he'd been staying. His money, $9.75, was still in his pocket, but his clothing was so worn and dirty that the authorities simply threw it all away. They dressed his body instead in clean garments, a white shirt, black clothing, and a pair of brand new satin slippers of a modern design. Pat Conley received the telegram and immediately traveled to Dubuque, accompanied by a friend, Mr. George Brown. The 2 men brought Michael's body home in a coffin. But as soon as the coffin entered the house, Elizabeth collapsed. Her swoon lasted several hours. When she awoke, she was pale, shaken, and insistent that something extraordinary had happened while she was unconscious. In her own words, "When they told me that father was dead, I felt very sick and bad. I did not know anything. Then father came to me." She said she saw him standing before her, wearing a white shirt, black clothes, and slippers she had never seen before. It was only later that she learned he was dressed exactly like this. In the dream, or vision, Michael spoke. He told her that inside his old grey shirt, sewn into a pocket made from a piece of her old red dress, he had hidden a roll of money. When Elizabeth regained full consciousness, she immediately asked Pat whether he had brought home their father's original clothes. "No," he replied. "Why?" "Because father told me," she said, "that he sewed money inside his grey shirt." Pat dismissed it at first, until Elizabeth slept again and saw her father a second time, repeating the same message. When she awoke, she urgently insisted, "Pat, you must go and get the clothes. Unable to ignore her conviction, Pat contacted Mr. Hoffman, the coroner in Dubuque. Hoffman searched the premises and discovered the discarded clothing bundled together in the backyard of the morgue. On February 9th, Pat travelled back to Dubuque. In his presence, Mr. Hoffman opened the bundle. Inside the old grey shirt was a pocket, hand-sewn, with long, uneven stitches clearly made by a man. The fabric was cut from Elizabeth's red dress. And inside the pocket was a roll of banknotes worth $35, just as the dream had described. Elizabeth had never seen the body in the coffin, nor did she know her father's original clothing had been thrown away. It was precisely because her dream showed him wearing unfamiliar garments, white shirt, black clothes, satin slippers, that she began asking about the old grey shirt. Whatever one believes about dreams, the facts were undeniable. The girl described something she could not possibly have known. And the hidden money was real. The Dead Shopman. Our next tale is not a dream, but something stranger. A quiet encounter that unfolded in full daylight, witnessed by a boy who did not yet understand what he had seen. The story comes from the brother of a well-known man of letters, a thoughtful, educated family, not one prone to superstition. As a young boy, he worked in a shop in a town we will call Wexington. The overseer there was a dark, thin, rather unhealthy-looking man. Months earlier, that overseer had died. One day, the boy was sent out on an errand. He delivered the message as instructed, but, as boys do, chose a longer, more interesting road for his return. Along the way, he paused before a bookseller's window, gazing at the illustrations inside. And that was when it began. He felt a sudden mental haziness. Not fear, not dizziness, just a light drifting of the mind, as though he were only half awake. It was close to the dinner hour, and he may have been hungry, but the sensation was unmistakable. He resumed his walk, and when he lifted his head, the dead overseer was beside him. What is most remarkable is this: he felt no surprise. They walked together for some distance, speaking casually about ordinary matters, shop business, familiar errands, everyday things. The boy noticed details that were too specific to be imagined. The man's boots, for instance, were laced in an odd, distinctive way. Nothing about the encounter felt dreamlike. It was simply happening. When they reached a crossing, the boy's attention was caught for a moment by something in the street. Traffic, a passer-by, he never quite remembered. He turned his head briefly, and when he looked back, the overseer was gone. There was no vanishing mist, no dramatic disappearance, just sudden, total absence, as though the man had never been there at all. The boy continued to the shop and quietly told a friend what had happened. He felt no fear, no lingering dread, only the fading echo of that early moment of vagueness. In all the years that followed, he never again experienced anything like it. No swoon, no apparition, no strange mental haze. Just a single, inexplicable meeting with someone long dead. This is not, strictly speaking, a ghost story. It is something subtler. A moment where the ordinary world seemed to overlap, just briefly, with something beyond it. And such accounts often lead us to tales like the old Wraith of Valogne, where two boys promised that whichever died first would appear to the other. In that case, too, the apparition arrived before news of the death, and after a fainting spell that left the survivor's health shaken for months. Whether these visions are dreams, illusions, or something else entirely, they linger because they feel less like fantasy and more like memories of a reality we do not yet understand. Under the Lamp. Our next tale takes us into the curious world of crystal gazing, a fashionable pastime of the late 19th century, where people sought visions inside a glass ball. It began when a gentleman gave such a glass ball to a young woman, Miss Bailey. She believed she could play the willing game, influencing another person's thoughts or actions without touching them, and even without their knowing they were being willed. But with the crystal ball, she saw almost nothing, so she lent it to her friend, Miss Leslie. Miss Leslie, to everyone's surprise, described a vivid scene: a large, square, old-fashioned red sofa draped in muslin. And days later, when she visited a neighbouring house, there it was, the sofa exactly as she had seen it in the crystal. Miss Bailey's brother, however, found all of this delightfully absurd. A strong young athlete, one expected to win the amateur golf championship. He teased the women about their visions. Then, out of sheer mischief, he took the crystal ball into the study. When he returned, the laughter had left him. He looked pale, gash, as the Scots say, and admitted reluctantly that he had seen something too. A person he knew sitting under a lamp. He said nothing more, only that he would discover during the week whether what he'd seen was true. The time was precisely 5:30 on a Sunday afternoon. 2 days later, on Tuesday, he attended a dance in a town 40 miles from home. There he encountered Miss Preston, a young woman he knew socially. As they spoke, he suddenly said, "On Sunday, about 5:30, you were sitting under a standard lamp, wearing a blue blouse with lace on the shoulders. You were pouring tea for a man in a blue serge suit. I could only see the tip of his mustache." Miss Preston stared at him. "The blinds must have been up," she said, but they hadn't been, and Mr. Bailey had been nowhere near the house. "I was at Dulby," he replied, and indeed, there was no question. He had been. This case is not as dramatic as some, but it is striking. The vision was simple, ordinary even. A woman at tea, a lamp, a blue blouse. Nothing supernatural, nothing impossible. Just a quiet moment seen at a distance of 40 miles through the glass surface of a crystal ball. Whether coincidence, intuition, or something else entirely, it left a once skeptical young man thoughtful and a little less inclined to laugh. The Cow with the Bell. Our next tale returns to the curious world of crystal gazing, a pastime that, for some, offered nothing but whimsical images, and for others, something much stranger. The storyteller had given a glass crystal ball to the wife of a friend, a woman whose visions became so vivid and, on one disturbing occasion, so inappropriate that she abandoned the practice altogether. But one day, the couple's young secretary, a student and golfer, picked up the ball out of curiosity. He stared into it for a few moments, then spoke. "I see a field I know very well," he said slowly. "A field I've walked through hundreds of times, but there's a cow in it I've never seen before." He described the animal precisely, a brown cow with white markings and, most unusual of all for Scotland, a bell hanging from her neck. A bell on a cow was almost unheard of in that part of the country. Perplexed, the young man set down the crystal and announced that he would walk to the field immediately to see whether such a creature existed. He returned stunned. The cow was there, brown, white-marked, and wearing the very bell he had seen inside the glass. It was exactly as the crystal had shown him, but this was only one example in a series of strange successes. In the spring of 1897, the author gave another glass ball to a young lady he had never met before. She knew nothing of crystal gazing, not even its reputation, but she had a history of spontaneous visions that came true. She had once even foreseen the outcome of the derby, enriching her friends through a perfectly described win by Perceval. With the crystal, her accuracy became startling. Time after time, she described people and places familiar to those she scried for, yet completely unknown to herself. She even once added a detail that no one present knew, a detail that was later verified to be correct. Of the small group who experimented with the ball, 4 others merely saw fanciful images, flowers, lights, shifting colors. But the young lady's visions were different, detailed, specific, and repeatedly true. The narrator, skeptical by nature, admitted, almost reluctantly, that chance alone could not explain her accuracy. The visions were too many, too precise, too far removed from random guessing. He conceded that thought transference, or mental telegraphy, could explain most cases, but not the one containing the unknown detail. Reluctant or not, he had to confess his astonishment. Anything less, he felt, would be dishonest. Yet he also admitted one thing more. If these cases are remarkable, the story that comes next is far more difficult to believe. A tale told by the Duc de Saint-Simon himself. A tale involving royalty, secrecy, and a vision so strange that even Saint-Simon, no lover of superstition, reported it only because the witness swore to it with absolute conviction. The Deathbed of Louis XIV. Our next tale is not merely strange. It is royal. It concerns a prophecy made 8 years before the death of King Louis XIV. A prophecy spoken by a child who had never seen a palace, never met a courtier, and knew nothing of Versailles. The account was given in strict confidence to Saint-Simon, the famous chronicler by the Duc d'Orléans himself, during a private conversation at Marly. Every detail that the child predicted eventually came to pass, despite being utterly impossible to foresee at the time. Let us begin with the setting. The Duc d'Orléans was a man of keen intelligence, restless curiosity, and, despite his brilliance, an unfortunate fascination with the occult. Like many nobles of his era, he had pursued every known method of conjuring spirits and foretelling the future, and though these efforts had never borne fruit, he remained drawn to anything supernatural. One day, while visiting the home of his mistress, Madame de la Série, he encountered a charlatan who claimed he could see visions in a simple glass of water, but only if the scryer, a child, gazed into the water for him. The chosen child was an 8 or 9-year-old girl who had lived her entire life in Madame de la Série's household. She was quiet, innocent, uneducated, and seemingly ordinary. Yet when she looked into the glass, the visions appeared instantly. To test the trickster, the Duc d'Orléans devised a trap. He secretly sent a messenger to the nearby home of Madame de Nongue, instructing him to observe in detail who was present, what they were doing, and how the room was arranged, then return without speaking to anyone. When the messenger came back, he privately reported everything to the Duke. Only then did the Duke ask the child to look into the water and describe what she saw at Madame de Noncre's home. To the astonishment of everyone present, she repeated, word for word, the messenger's report The same guests, the same card players, the same clothing, postures, and furniture. To remove any doubt, the Duke sent the messenger back for a second verification. Again, the child had been correct. Most nobles would have stopped there. But the Duc d'Orléans, emboldened by what he had witnessed, decided on a far more daring question. Show me the scene at the death of the king. Remember, this was the year 1706. Louis XIV was alive, powerful, and seemingly in full health. His court bustled with princes, princesses, heirs, and attendants. The child, who had never heard of Versailles, began to describe a room she had never seen. Yet piece by piece, she painted the exact layout of the king's private bedchamber at Versailles, as it would appear 8 years later. She described the heavy bed, the ornate furniture, the courtiers standing around the king, Madame de Maintenon, the royal physicians, Madame de Ventadour, cradling a small child decorated with an order, various princes and noble ladies, even the household staff. Every detail matched what would eventually happen during Louis XIV's final hours. But then came the strangest part. The Duc d'Orléans noticed that several key members of the royal family, the king's son, grandson, and their wives, were missing from the child's vision. He asked her again and again, "Do you see Monseigneur, the Duc de Bourgogne, the Duchess of Burgundy, the Duc de Berry?" Each time she shook her head. She did not see them at the king's deathbed. This puzzled the Duke deeply, for in 1706 all these nobles were alive and well, powerful, young, seemingly destined to outlive the king. Yet, astonishingly, every single one of them died before Louis XIV. Not one survived to stand at his bedside. Only years later, after their unexpected deaths, did the full weight of the child's vision become clear. What took place during that simple séance with a glass of water in 1706 had, impossibly, foretold the royal death chamber of 1714. This story is one of the most astonishing crystal vision accounts ever recorded, a mixture of court intrigue, prophecy, and eerie accuracy that baffled even Saint-Simon, a man famous for his skepticism. And now, we stand at the edge of these mysteries, having traced dreams and visions from humble cottages to the gilded halls of Versailles. The Old Family Coach. Our next tale is not a dream, nor a prophecy, nor a vision in a crystal. It is something quieter and far more unsettling, precisely because of its simplicity. It happened in the New Forest, an ancient stretch of woodland where sunlight falls in broken patches, and mist lingers in hollows even on bright days. A distinguished country gentleman, Mr. Hindford, known for his intelligence, scientific interests, and entirely practical nature, was riding alone along one of the grassy glades. He was miles from home, about 12 miles out, and at a point where the forest paths twisted and intersected in confusing ways. Realizing he was unsure of the correct route to a nearby country town, he slowed his horse to look around, and that was when he heard wheels. On the far side of a patch of bushes, a carriage rolled softly over the turf. A moment later, it reached a gap in the greenery and came fully into view. What Mr. Hindford saw was perfectly ordinary, and yet it was not. The carriage was a slightly old-fashioned family coach, with green panels painted in a pattern that imitated wickerwork, the sort of vehicle common a generation earlier. The coachman looked the part of a respectable household servant. He handled 2 horses with steady hands. Inside the coach sat 2 elderly ladies. One wore a bonnet, the other a hat. Everything about them suggested gentility, routine, and the quiet dignity of country life. They passed unhurriedly along the glade, relieved at the chance to ask for directions. Mr. Hindford guided his horse through the gap in the bushes and found himself alone. The lane ended abruptly in a tangle of bramble and brush. There was no carriage, no horses, no coachmen, no elderly ladies, not even the faintest trace of wheel ruts on the grass. Puzzled, he rode back to his original vantage point. Studying the terrain carefully, there was no path they might have taken, no turn he might have missed, no object that could have deceived him into imagining such a detailed, precise scene. Nothing. And that is the entire story. There was no ghostly mist, no vanishing in the manner of a theatrical apparition, only a perfectly ordinary coach and its passengers travelling along a forest glade where, quite simply, no coach could have been. The mystery lies not in drama, but in the quiet impossibility of the scene. A rational man saw something that rationally could not have existed, and the forest kept its silence. Riding home from mess. Our next tale comes from the year 1854, from the shadowed hill station of Muri in the Punjab, where moonlight falls silver across the slopes, and where the boundaries between the living and the dead sometimes seem thin as mist. General, then Lieutenant Barter, was a young officer of the 75th Regiment, stationed at Muri. He lived in a house recently built by another officer, Lieutenant B, who, records later confirmed, had died at Peshawar on January 2nd of that same year. The house stood alone on a spur of the hillside, connected to the main road above by a steep bridle path. It was a narrow, winding track, never used by horsemen, and ending abruptly at a sheer drop. A footpath from the house joined it halfway up. One moonlit evening, Mr. Barter was entertaining friends, Mr. and Mrs. Dean, who stayed until nearly 11. The night was brilliant, lit by a tropical full moon bright enough to read by. Barter escorted his guests to the bridle path, watched them climb toward the main road, and lingered there a moment longer with his 2 dogs, smoking a cigar. And then he heard hoofbeats on a path where no horse should ever tread. Around a bend in the bridle path above him, something came into view. First, the unmistakable outline of a tall hat, then the upper body of a rider, and finally, a pony stepping slowly into the moonlight, attended by 2 native grooms. Barter's dogs whimpered and crouched at his side, trembling. The moon was so bright that the entire group was illuminated as clearly as if it were midday. He could see the rider perfectly. He was dressed in full evening attire, white waistcoat, black coat, and a tall chimney pot hat. He sat heavily, almost lifelessly, on a powerful dark brown hill pony with a black mane and tail. The reins hung slack in his hands, while the grooms walked beside him, steadying both man and beast. The rider looked down. Barter felt ice run through him. He recognized the face, bloated, pale as death, framed by an unkempt black fringe of beard. It was Lieutenant B, the man who had built the house, the man who had died. Barter shouted instinctively, "Quan Hai!" "Who is it?" Then in English, half in challenge, half in fear, "Hello, what the devil do you want here?" The group halted. The dead man gathered the reins with both hands, turned slightly in the saddle, and showed his face fully in the moonlight. A dead man's face. Barter leapt up the bank toward the bridle path, but the earth slid beneath him. He scrambled, slipped, clawed his way upward, and reached the path at last. The riders were gone. There was nowhere they could have gone. No turning, no track, no path but the precipice below. Barter ran up the bridle path for 100 yards. Nothing. No hoofbeats, no voices, no movement, only the moonlit silence. His dogs refused to follow him. The next day, Barter cautiously steered conversation with his friend Dean toward Lieutenant B, and learned several facts he had not known. Lieutenant B had grown bloated before his death. He had allowed a dark fringe of beard to grow. He had indeed owned a powerful dark brown pony with a black mane and tail. And the pony had died too, killed in a reckless downhill gallop. Everything Barter had seen was correct. Details he had never been told. In the nights that followed, Barter and his wife often heard hoofbeats on that forbidden path. His Hindu servant once lay in wait with a lathi, determined to confront whatever made the sound. But when the hoofbeats passed him, he said it was like being overtaken by a typhoon. A rush of sound, nothing seen. Whatever the apparition was, it was more than a simple ghost. It described facts the living did not know. It frightened dogs. It walked a path no living horse could safely descend. And it was riding home from mess, as Lieutenant B had often done while alive and perhaps even after death. And so, dear listeners, our journey through 12 strange visitations comes to an end. Dreams that crossed into daylight, visions that knew more than the waking mind, and apparitions that refused to stay silent. If these stories stirred your curiosity, your imagination, or perhaps even a quiet shiver, do consider supporting this little archive of shadows. A like helps more than you know, and a subscription ensures you never miss the next descent into the uncanny. Until then, sleep lightly, dream wisely, and as ever, stay curious.